Hi, it's the 21st of August, 2026. My name is Kate Arnak. You're on my YouTube, you're watching me on my YouTube channel. I'm a writer, and you can find me on Amazon Kindle. I have a website. I write music and I write songs, lyrics. You can listen to my songs. So that's me. Anyway, if you want more information about what I'm talking about, go to my website and uh, I I've posted the names, websites, etc. of my sources, so you can take a look for yourself. And I want to talk about history a little bit. Um, to give some background on the political issues I'm talking about in my other videos. Oh, my blouse is not proper. There we go. Well, I'm Dutch, and I love history. And I've read some. I started reading some books on the French Revolution, and as I was reading, but I also um, read books like The Wealth of Nations and Why Do Nations Fail, and Economy, and the American Revolution and the Dutch Revolution. Yes, in fact, the Dutch invented democracy. Do you know that in the 16th century, we were the first to become a republic? We were ruled by the Spanish king, and we had a war of independence, and we won. And we founded the Republic of the United Netherlands, and we had a parliament which was elected, of course, only by rich men. Women couldn't vote, and poor people couldn't vote. But it was it was quite one of the first, and at the time it was the only democracy in the world. And in fact, when they started writing the American Constitution, they were inspired by the Dutch Constitution in the 16th century, written in the 16th century, 1500 something, I forgot. I'll write it in one of my essays, and you can, I wrote an essay about this, so you can read the essay and have all the dates and names. Because the most important person in the history of Holland is Willem van Oranje, who became general and ruler, stadhouder, and liberated us. He was the head general of our army, and we won against the Spanish. But we did have a parliament, and we had 7 provinces, and each province had elected representatives that were in The Hague to represent the country. And Willem van Oranje was stadhouder, but he was a sort of president, but actually he wasn't. He was just a general, and he couldn't spend any money without consent from Parliament. And so that is the basic rule of democracy, is that the representatives are chosen by the people. even if it's only men who are not poor, and that Parliament controls the money. They can levy the taxes, and then they decide where the taxes are spent on defense, but also on roads, ports, harbors, navy, justice, police, etc. So the Dutch already had that in the 16th century. So we were actually the first. And well, of course, Athens was the first democracy, which was also where only men with money could vote. It wasn't a democracy like we have today, where everybody who's human can vote. In Athens, we had, and that was a bird flying into my window. Oh dear. Well, anyway, Athens, yes, they did have a democracy, but the only people who were allowed to participate in politics and to vote were men with money. And in fact, women had no rights in Athens. They couldn't own property, they couldn't run businesses. They were totally dependent on their husbands. And of course, you had a lot of slaves and slavery in Athens. So, in fact, Holland in the 16th century was, quite a step up from Athenian democracy. We got, the females got the right to vote in 1918. Just after the end of the First World War. And first the right to vote, and then the right, a few years later, the right to be elected. So in that, the Dutch were not special. Anyway, French Revolution. So I was reading about the French Revolution and all the other revolutions, and basically, it's about the money. Okay. Because kings and tyrannies and 1% and all these things, we'll just call them a king. The king and the elite, the 1%, they owned all the land, and they owned all production, and they owned they had all the rights. They were the judges. They were the tax collectors. They had all the cushy jobs. And all the taxes that were collected went to the 1%, to the king and to the elite. And the king and the elite, they didn't pay taxes. Even when they owned all the land, they didn't pay taxes on that. The only people paying taxes in France were the peasants and the people in town who were working or had small businesses. And then, of course, you had the church, because you had the nobility and you had the church. Now, the church didn't have much say in the 18th century in France, in the period up to the revolution, but they were extremely wealthy. They were very rich. They too owned a lot of land, a lot of monasteries, churches, mills, factories, etc. And they didn't pay taxes. The only people paying taxes were the peasants. I won't call them farmers because they were too poor, and the peasants, and the people in town who who had little workshops where they made cabinets and stuff like that, the artisans. And then over the years, what had developed in the 17th and 18th century was a bourgeoisie, a sort of upper middle class, traders, people who owned plantations in the colonies, people who did business mostly. And this bourgeoisie was actually the people who started the French Revolution, because they paid taxes. They were still the third class. First class was, of course, king and nobility. Second class was church. And then third class was from the peasant up to the rich merchant. And they paid taxes. And then they were saying, well, if I'm going to pay taxes, I want to decide how that money is spent. And that was the start of the American Revolution as well. No taxation without representation. And it wasn't the peasants in America who wanted, who rebelled against the English king. It was the rich upper class who rebelled, because they had to pay a huge amount of tax, and all that money went to the British Isles and to the king, who paid for his wars and stuff like that. But none of it was invested in the colonies. They didn't get roads. They didn't get public works. They didn't get clean water. They didn't get any of that. All that money was just being sucked from the colonies to London. Because that's what the UK did. They conquered lands and they sucked all the money out of it. And that is, but most of that money just went to the 1%. And that is how they paid for wars. Because in fact, the Americans were the first to fight as soldiers and officers in a war for their own land and country. Because before that, wars were always fought by mercenaries. Kings used the money from taxes to hire mercenaries from all over Europe to fight. So you would have a French army and a German army or an English army, and on both sides there would be Germans, there would be Slovenes, Hungarians, Russians, there would be people from Africa, there would be people from all over, whoever paid them to fight. So that was the traditional war, and the Americans actually changed that by saying, no, I'm fighting for free, because they were promised some money, but George Washington had a hell of a time paying his soldiers. Many of them accepted the fact that they weren't paid now and wouldn't be paid in the near future, but this was their country and they were fighting for their country. And actually, the American Civil War caused the French Revolution. You go, what? Yeah. Because about 10 years before the American Revolution, 10 to 8 years, something like that, there had been a war between England and France. And many of the fighting was over the colonies, because that's where the money was. They were dividing up the world between them. It's just, the same game we play today, where there's a map of the world and All the guys with their knives are carving out pieces for themselves. The game is called World Dominance, or some call it imperialism, building of empires. Anyway, so there was this war between England and France, and it was fought in a lot of it was fought in the colonies, in America. There were other colonies they were fighting as well in the East, but I'm just concentrating on America, and the French had lost French Canada, and they had lost Louisiana, French Canada, and they wanted it back. So they thought, well, if we support the American colonists in the fight to liberate themselves from the English, then the English are going to be so engaged fighting the Americans, the American colonists, that we can sneak behind them and reconquer French Canada. And even the Americans can help us get French Canada back. That was why the French king declared war on England when the American Revolution started, because he thought, well, this is my opportunity to get French Canada back, because that was a highly profitable colony. He was making a lot of money in French Canada, and he wanted it back because, it was a lot of money. And he thought, if I can get the Americans to win, then the Americans will help me get French Canada back. And I can do business with America and make a lot of money. And there was some discussion about Louisiana, etc. Well, anyway, so the French king spent a huge amount of money on the war in fighting the British in North America. Huge amount of money. Like an entire fleet which defeated the English fleet at Chesapeake Bay. In fact, the French fleet defeating the British fleet in Chesapeake Bay had as direct result that I forgot the name of the town. Oh dear. Well, it was the biggest victory, land victory. I forget the name of the town. Well, anyway, they surrendered, and the war was over after that, with the skirmishes, etc. But the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay was the turning point. That is the moment when the Americans won, when the French won. And then, to his great disappointment, the Americans did not help him get French Canada back. And actually in Canada, he tried to get French Canada back, but he couldn't do it. And he ran out of money. And then the French government was broke. And this was now the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille is in 1789. I always remember because it's 1789 if you write it. 1789, that was storming of the Bastille. But in the 5 years before, after the American Revolution and not getting the French colonies back, the French king had lost a huge amount of money, and he didn't get his colonies back, so he didn't get any profit. And the Americans weren't paying him because they were broke. They were actually borrowing 5 million from the Dutch bank, curse. And So it was a great debacle, and the French government was in dire straits financially. So what the French king actually tried to do was tax the rich and the church. And if they'd just been reasonable and say, okay, we'll contribute a little bit in paying the government's debts, because the French king was this much in debt, just like King Trump, who's 40 trillion in debt. Well, the French king was big in debt, way over his GDP. Way over 100% GDP. And because governments didn't start borrowing this century, they started borrowing 5,000 years ago or 8,000 years. The Babylonian governments borrowed, and had debts. But the French king, because he couldn't get the French colonies back, so he didn't have any income from that, and he was so deep in debt, and the church and the elite refused to pay taxes. Zero. And that was the most stupid thing they could have done. If they had just helped the king a little bit, just to pay his interest and to just get him, save the French state from bankruptcy. And, but they didn't. They were adamant. They were not paying taxes. Zero. They didn't give a fuck. Zero fucks. Zero taxes. The French king had to solve the problem on his own. And he couldn't. And he was in debt. And then he made a desperate plea to the Swiss, and they lent him some money. But, there just wasn't enough income, because the rich, all the landowners, all the nobility, and all the church didn't pay taxes. Now, there's your lessons, guys, because as you all know, not only did the whole elite and landowners and nobility end up having their heads chopped off because they wouldn't pay taxes. The angry, hungry hordes came and they chopped off their heads on the guillotine. So think about that, Musk. And Bezos and all you other guys who refuse to pay zero taxes. There's a reason why Musk wants to go to Mars. He's deadly afraid of the hungry hordes, who can't afford to pay a piece of bread and who will come for him and chop his head off. Because that's what happened in the French Revolution. The rich and the church refused to pay taxes. The king couldn't borrow anymore, and the French nation went bankrupt. That is what happened. So then, let me just give you a sneak peek at the ending. The church lost all their land in the revolution. They confiscated the land from the nobility, the elite, and the church. So the church lost all their land. It all became government owned, and then it was sold for a few dollars to their friends, because it was just 1% taking over from the other 1%. That's the French Revolution. Anyway, so the church lost everything. They lost their lands, they lost their monasteries, and all the people who worked for the church, from the bishops to the monks to they were giving a small salary, very small salary, by the government, because they were now government employees living in government housing, having a very little income, a salary, for doing what they were supposed to do, like read mass and stuff like that. Gone were the days of plenty. So, but then again, the Christian church was built on the Christian idea of sharing and being and living simple life. So that's what all the clergy were doing now, living very simple Christian lives. But that's because they said we will pay zero taxes. And what happens? They lost everything. The only thing they didn't lose was their head, and the nobility, they lost their head, along with all their property. Anyway, that's how it ends. So why do we say, if it's just 1%, one elite taking over from the other elite, why are we so enthusiastic about the French Revolution, and why are we saying that was the start of democracy? Well, that is because the French king, in a last desperate plea to pay his debts, called Parliament. And that hadn't been done in like 50 years or something. Because the French king only calls for Parliament when he wants money. And this French king really, really, really needed money. He was broke. The French nation was broke. So he called Parliament, and Parliament had representatives from the church, from the nobility, and from the third estate, from all the others. All the others paid taxes, but Parliament was 1/3 a church, 1/3 nobility, and 1/3 third estate. Third class, you might say. And the king was hoping that to convince the nobility and the church to pay taxes. And in return, he would give them more power in the French government. And that actually happened with the Magna Carta in Britain, starting from 1100. Because democracy in Britain very slowly grew every century, because every time the king wanted money from his subjects, especially from those subjects who owned the land and had the money, which is the nobility, which were in Parliament, because Parliament was run by the nobility. The House of Lords is called the House of Lords because there were lords in there. That was nobility. And there was a small parliament which grew and grew and grew in power, where ordinary people, well, men who had money, the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, would also participate in government, and that's Parliament we now know in Britain, and they would choose their representatives. So what happened in Britain, that every time the king wanted money, he went to Parliament, and every time Parliament gave him money, in return, the king signed away some of his power, some of his privileges. He signed them over to Parliament. So very slowly, the king's power moved to Parliament every time Parliament paid taxes, which to me is a wonderful way of increasing government, because there was no violent revolution and like in France. But because even when the king called Parliament, the church and the nobility flatly refused to pay taxes, even though the king begged them, because the French nation couldn't pay the interest on his debts anymore. They were going to be declared bankrupt, and that meant that all the properties would be seized by the Swiss bankers and the Dutch bankers and the German bankers. But the nobility said, no, it's a principle. And the church said, no, it's a principle. We are not paying taxes. And then the king said, yeah, well, I'll give you some of my powers. I'll give you the power to declare war. I'll give you the power to negotiate with international trade agreements. I'll give you the power. He tried. In fact, he was one of the best kings France ever had. And they chopped off his head. He really, really tried. But he didn't force the nobility and the church to pay taxes. Because he was a very timid man. And he was easily intimidated. And he would say, oh, would you please? And then the nobility would say, no. And then he would go, oh, well, I'm going to Versailles. I'm going hunting. And the king would disappear. And then a few months later, you'd go again, oh, could you please? No! No! And then the king went away again. So that was the second reason the king went bankrupt. And I think if he had made a deal with some of his bankers, they would have given him money to raise an army to take taxes from the church and basically start a civil war, or have a very intense tax collecting campaign. But the king just he locked himself in his room, and he fixed horloges, watches, and clocks. His passion was clocks. And he had his study or his workroom, and they were full of clocks, and he would tinker with his clocks. That's what the king did. He was a very timid. He wasn't supposed to be king, you see. He was the second son. And he was sent to the monastery so as not to be a threat to his older brother, who was supposed to be king. And his older brother was brash and strong and, raised to be a king. And then, by the time when he was 18 or something, or 20, he had a horrible accident and died. So suddenly, this timid little younger brother, who had always been raised in the church, in monasteries, and told to shut up, basically, suddenly he was made king, and he had to rule and decide and be strong, and he just wasn't. He was just a wimp, and he just fixed his clocks. So that's the reason the French Revolution happened. The French nation went bankrupt. They couldn't pay the interest on their debts. The clergy, the church, and the nobility refused to pay taxes, and the peasants were so poor they were starving in winter because they had 2 or 3 bad harvests one year after the other, with droughts and floods. There wasn't enough grain. So there was no bread, and people in the streets of Paris were starving. You could step over the starving corpses as you were, walking down the street. Not that the nobility ever walked. They got in their carriage with the horses, and they drove past, and they had this big handkerchief against the horrible smell of the city with all the rotting corpses. That was Paris. So then the king basically turned to the upper middle class, upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, and they said, well, you have to pay more taxes and more and more and more. And then the bourgeoisie said, well, fuck it. If the nobles and the church aren't paying, we're not paying either. Zero taxes for us. We're not paying anymore. And then when the hungry hordes took the pitchforks and spikes and timber pots, and they walked to Versailles, and they said, we want bread, we want bread. The nobility, the bourgeoisie thought, we can take advantage of that. And there were a lot of intellectuals who were already talking and writing for 50 years. Rousseau, Locke, the whole Enlightenment literature and intellectuals and salons were already talking about the fact that a government shouldn't be a king and his subjects, and that the king was not appointed by God, he was just a man. And they said, well, look at England, where Parliament had some power, and they said, well, people should govern themselves. And if I pay taxes, I want to decide where the money's going. Not some war in the Americans. I want decent roads. I want clean water. I want plumbing. I want sewage control. I want justice. If I have a dispute, I want to be able to afford a judge. And I want to have a say in what happens in my country. And it's the same thing. And the Americans had won a war for that. And they gained their independence. And they said, no taxation without representation. That's the whole thing. And the French were saying exactly the same thing. And they took the French, the English, the American Constitution, and they wrote their own, inspired by the American Revolution and the Dutch Revolution 200 years before, and all the intellectuals writing, and they wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The American Constitution, written later, said we take these things to be self-evident, that each man is born free and has the right to the pursuit of happiness. Well, of course, that wasn't true, because not everybody was born free. They weren't putting an end to slavery here. Let's be very clear about that. And in French, it's even more obvious, because it's droit de l'homme, which means man, which means masculine, someone who has a penis, basically. So there are actually intellectual French women who were very influential with the salons, and they wrote the droit de femme, the right of females, and they wrote it in such a way that they had the same rights as males. So it was really exciting times. The hungry hordes were on the streets, and in the intellectual salons, the women and the men, and they were debating about whether a king was God appointed, or if there should be elections and there should be parliament, and people should have rights as well as duties. And what democracy was and who should have the right to vote. And there were influential women who were saying, if there's going to be a parliament, then women should have the right to vote as well. And if we have freedom, then women should have the same rights and the same freedoms as men. And they should have the right to get a divorce. And they should have the right to own their own property and decide about their own money. So that was already, this war of the sexes was really heated in this French Revolution. Because the women were saying, well, if you men are going for human rights, then we want human rights as well. And the right for the people. And when you talk about the people, you talk about men and women. We have the same rights as men. And that was actually the first feminist wave. And there's some beautiful books they wrote and pamphlets, and they protested, etc. So that was a heavy debate, but it was mostly done by the intellectuals. The ordinary people just wanted something to eat. Because, they had this big round bread. And ordinary people had one bread a day. If they worked a whole day, they got 2.5 sous. And for 2.5 sous, they could buy one loaf of bread. That was ordinary people. I'm not talking about the peasants on the countryside, because they were so poor, every winter they would drop like flies from starvation. But they were bound by their lands and they didn't come to Paris. So the French Revolution was basically in Paris, in Bordeaux, in the big harbors where there was a bourgeoisie and traders and people who made money. Anyway. But in the French streets, out on the street, suddenly from 2.5 sous, the bread went to 5 sous, which meant that they could only have one loaf of bread every 2 days. They were starving. That is why these hungry hordes took to the streets. And then the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie took the opportunity, and they went to the king and they said, we can entice these hordes, and we want rights. And then, because Parliament was still there, 1/3 church, 1/3 nobility, and 1/3 the third class. So then the bourgeois talked to the king and they said, well, if you give the third class more than 50% voting power in Parliament, then we can overrule the church and nobility, and we will make a constitution. We will take power from you, but this Parliament, which is more than 50% from the third class, we will make sure this Parliament, which is made up of us, will decide to tax the nobility and the church. And the king said, yes, of course. Well, actually, he just sort of mumbled and went back to his workshop with clocks. At this point, the king wasn't running the show anymore. There were hungry hordes, tens of thousands, outside his bedroom window. He was just scared shitless. He just locked himself up with his clocks, And then there was the storming of the Bastille, the French merchant women who walked to Versailles, took the French family, got them to the palace in Paris, where they were prisoners. And then actually the hustle for power started. Parliament, and especially the Third Estate, adopted the rights of man, human rights, the Constitution. um, wrote bills about um, um, reorganizing the state into communities and provinces, and how men with money were able to, or property, were able to vote for parliament, and parliament would replace the king, etc. A constitutional monarchy where most of the power was taken from the king to parliament. But it was too late. It was too late. Because all the international banks said, we want our money. And if you don't give us our money, we'll come and get it. And the people on the streets were starving, because there'd been another problem with another failed harvest. But the king didn't have any money to buy not bread, flour. He didn't have any money to buy flour from other countries to feed his people. And then a few smart guys said, follow me. And they started confiscating all the lands from the rich and the elite and the nobility, and dividing it up amongst themselves and selling them off. And with that money, they paid the interest on the debts for 1 year. So they became the new 1% because they simply confiscated the lands of all the people who had land and all the property. And they kept a lot, but they sold off part of it. And with that money, they paid the debtors of the French nation. And the nobility protested, of course. And then the leaders like Robespierre, the more radical types, said they took power and they controlled parliament, and they said, well, we have to take their lands and sell them off to pay for to pay the interest on our debts, and to buy flour to feed the people. So they bought. With that money, they bought flour to feed the people, and the people were content. The revolution, they had won the revolution. But the nobility protested. So Robespierre, who had heard of this wonderful invention, the guillotine, where you could very efficiently kill people and dispatch and execute them, he started executing all the nobility, and everybody was all the poor people and all the starving people who had been starving and treated badly by the nobility. But everybody was happy. But after 1 or 2 years, they'd sold off all the property. For a lot of people got rich, were buying all these estates for just a little bit of money. It was one big bonanza. So then the people were protesting again that there was no more money. So then they decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take the money and land from the church. So they confiscated all the church lands. They kept a lot for themselves and their friends. And they sold off the rest. And a lot of it was sold for very little money. So they could pay the debtors the interest on their debt for a few more years, and they could pay to buy flour to feed the people. But then that money was gone as well. So then the hungry hordes turned on Robespierre and his friends, who had guillotined everybody else, and then they were guillotined, because they couldn't feed the people. Because that is basically, if you can't pay the debtors, you can't buy flour and you can't feed the people. So then France had nothing. Because they'd taken all the lands from the nobility, and the nobles were dead. Had their head chopped off. By that time, the king had his head chopped off as well, and the queen, etc. And they'd taken all the money from the church, and they sold it off. And there they were left with the same elite. There were different people, but it was still a country run by a small elite who owned all the land. So then they thought, we'll bring back the king and some nephew or something. And the nephew said to the rich people, will you please pay taxes to pay the interest on the debts? And they said exactly the same thing. These nouveau riches, who had replaced the old riche, the old 1%, new 1% said, well, and we're not paying taxes. So we're actually at exactly the same situation where they've been for years, that there simply wasn't enough money to pay the interest on the debts. And the foreign armies were all around France waiting to invade, because France could not afford to pay mercenaries to defend itself. So suddenly, because everybody knew that France was broke, there was no more money, and all around Germany, Italy, Austria, all the country, England, they were all buying mercenaries to invade France and simply divide it up between themselves, because France couldn't afford to pay for the mercenaries to have an army. And then Napoleon came. Yeah, because he was desperate. And then Napoleon came, a general, a decorated general, because he had won against several Italian battles, and he had conquered land in Italy, which made a lot of money for the rich. And Napoleon said, I have a bright idea. Because the vultures are massing on the borders. They're seeing a very weak France. And they're ready to divvy it up and conquer it. So Napoleon said, I can fight off any army. You know what my bright idea is? Conscription. That's Napoleon. He invented conscription, which means that the sons of France, the sons of the nation, because that was the moment when they were saying, where they created a nation state. The idea that we are a nation, we are French, we are one people, and we're proud of it. And Napoleon said, yeah, I'll take your young men, and I'll put them in uniform, and I'll go out and defeat every country. And conscription, when people are fighting for their country, first of all, he did pay them wages, and widows and mothers were giving compensation if their sons died. But how did Napoleon pay these soldiers? Well, with bounty, of course, because France didn't have any money. He couldn't pay his conscripted soldiers, but he could take his conscripted soldiers, conquer half of Europe, a lot of it. He even went to Moscow, which was his demise. It was the result of his downfall. Everybody who ever tried to conquer Russia and Moscow, they lost everything. But at first, Napoleon conquered Belgium, Holland, Germany, Austria, Italy, the whole of Italy, Poland, Prussia, the Balkans. He invaded and conquered almost all of Europe. And all the booty was carted off to France. That is why the Louvre, which on his demand was turned into a museum, but it was full of all the plunder from all the countries around. He was a very successful imperialist. And that was the idea. If your country's going broke, and you already taken all the money from the nobility, and you've taken all the money from the church, and you only have poor people and rich who refuse, the 1% who refuse to pay taxes because they own the government, which is exactly what is happening in America. They're already deep in debt. They have to borrow 1 or 2 trillion every year to pay the interest on the debts. And that can only go on so long. At some point, somebody's going to say, I'm not lending you any more money to pay the interest on your debts. You will have to pay the interest yourself. You cannot borrow any more. And then what do? Well, you invade another country like Venezuela, where you sell all the oil but keep the money for yourself, because all the oil that's been sold since the invasion, since Trump took over, 12 billion in 6 months, and it's on a bank account somewhere in the Bahamas or something like that, some tax haven, in the name of Trump and his friends. They stole all the Venezuelan oil and they sold it for 12 billion, and the people of Venezuela, you know how much they get? 100 million. Well, not the people, the 1% of Venezuela. They got 100 million, and Trump and his friends pocketed 12 billion in 6 months. They are making 24 billion a year, and the Venezuelan people get 0. That is imperialism top. That is what Napoleon did. Trump loves Napoleon because he stole all the money. Only Napoleon shared his booty with the 1%, so they made him emperor. And he paid off the interest and some of France's debts. That's what Napoleon did. That's why the French love Napoleon, because he paid off, not all of them, but he paid off some of their debts. And because of everything he stole and plundered, but also he invited, he provided the money for his friends to invest in building factories and do research and build better factories and manufacture and produce goods. So he invested in the French economy and built factories and tried out new inventions and science and more efficient agriculture. And he did some really good things, like he gave Europe the law books for the Code Civil and the Code Penal, which is the code for when persons have disputes among each other, and trade disputes and rent and marriage and stuff like that, and the Code Penal, which is the criminal code. And Europe, still many countries were forced to introduce the Code Penal and Code Civil, but it was a great improvement, and they kept it, and they kept building on it. So the basis of most of the law systems, the system of law in most of Europe that was conquered by Napoleon, is actually his law books, which are only 200 years old. And that's a wonderful thing, because it allows us to trade and have access to disputes and judges and justice. And with the king, you had to pay for justice, and only the rich could do that. So Napoleon gave us the rule of law and the law books, and a system of justice, and a system of police, and a system of registration, and very efficient tax collecting, because they were all. He introduced boroughs and cities, administrative units, where all the people who lived there and all their wealth was known, and they were taxed very efficiently. Because there were a lot of things, good things Napoleon did, but basically he conquered all of Europe, murdered or had, as a result, millions, dozens of millions of soldiers and civilians died, and more were injured, and in the conquered countries, he didn't care if people were fed. So there were huge famines, and he stole everything from the upper class and the nobility and the bourgeoisie in the lands he conquered. And he was just like this black hole, like this big sucker, originating from Paris, like this big Hoover, just hoovering all the wealth and property and assets of whole of Europe and funneling it all to Paris. So a lot of people got poor and a few people got rich. So imperialism makes a lot of people poor and a few people rich. But he did make sure that the bourgeoisie was enlarged, and that there was more commerce, and there was more production, factories, science, etc. So he developed the country so that after he was gone, they could pay the interest on their loans, the tax was more efficient, and they weren't wasting their money on wars, because Parliament doesn't like to go to war. It costs money. So after Napoleon had saved the country financially by taking money from the rest of Europe to pay his debts, stealing it, robbing it, robbery, homicide. People call it war. I call it robbery, homicide. And that was basically the end of the French Revolution, because there was, after Napoleon, there came a new republic, and they started rebuilding some form of democracy, which in the end resulted in the general democracy we have today, where everybody has the right to vote. And right now in the USA, the same thing is happening. The USA is on the brink of not being able to pay the interest on their debts, because right now they're paying the interest on the debts by borrowing more money. But at some point, the bankers are going to say, actually the other countries are going to say, we're not going to borrow you any more money to pay the interest on your debts. You have to be able to pay the interest on your debts. We're not borrowing you any more money. And that is why Trump is so imperialist. That is why he's trying to annex Greenland. That is why he wants Canada to become the 52nd state. That is why he's trying to, having war in the Middle East to actually, he started it to extract more money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. He wanted them to pay him and pay him and pay him so his army would defend them. The only problem now is his army can't defend them against Iran. He's losing the war. So his imperialist play to get money from the Middle East for himself is failing. But it did succeed in Venezuela. The only problem is he's keeping the money for himself and his friends, and the same goes for the stable coins and the financial insider trading, etc. Now, if he had been using the money he was stealing with the American army, which is paid for by the government, he's using the army as his personal armed robbers. Because whatever they rob from other countries, he's using the money for himself, and he's putting it in bank accounts, billions and billions and billions in bank accounts in the Caribbean and all kinds of international black market, whatever, banks. And that is very stupid of him. Because Napoleon did get rich, and he made his sisters and brothers king all over Europe, from Holland and Italy, etc., etc. But he also made sure he invested in France, and he took the money and he asked his friends and entrepreneurs to invest in France. So there would be some kind of production, some kind of economy. And what Trump is doing, the 1% is not paying taxes. His budget is hopelessly overdrawn. He has to borrow to pay for the interest. And everything he steals, he keeps for himself and his friends. So he is accelerating the road to bankruptcy for his country. He's not governing his country. He's not doing anything for his country except robbing it and using its army to enrich himself. Now, take a lesson from history and remember that when the 1% said they refused to pay taxes, to pay for the interest on the debts, not only did France go bankrupt, their heads were chopped off and all their money was confiscated. So take a lesson from that, Musk and Bezos. Well, they're off to Mars. They're too much afraid they'll end up in the guillotine. But imperialism, as Napoleon has proven, as the British Empire has proven, it does work to save a country from bankruptcy, but not if the 1% take all the stolen money and put it in their personal bank account. So the United States is going bankrupt, and well, look at history. Well, that's it for today.